Hello, welcome to CrossCurrents, produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. I'm Barbara Rutstein, the moderator for today's program. The views expressed here are solely those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the City of Fort Collins or the Larimer County League of Women Voters. Our topic today is, why are we voting on wolves in Colorado? The topic of wolves in Colorado is not a new one. The Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission has discussed the reintroduction of wolves 4 times since 1982. The last time was in 2016. Each time, the commission has concluded that it did not have the authority to make this decision. They believe that it must be a legislative decision. Since the legislature has been reluctant to take up the issue, last year advocates used the initiative process to gather sufficient signatures to put a statute on the 2020 ballot for voters to decide the issue. The ballot issue number is 107. And calls for the reintroduction of gray wolves on designated lands west of the Continental Divide. There are provisions for hearings, the use of scientific data, as well as restoration and management plans coordinated by the Parks and Wildlife Commission. There is a provision for compensation to owners of livestock for losses caused by gray wolves. To get some perspective on Initiative 107, we have a panel with varying viewpoints. On my right is Erin Karney, for Industry Advancement Director for the Colorado Cattlemen's Association. On her right is Rick Knight, Professor Emeritus of Wildlife Conservation at Colorado State University. On his right is Taylor Szilagyi, Director of Public Communications for the Colorado Farm Bureau. On her right is Delia Malone, Wildlife Committee of the Sierra Club, the Colorado chapter. Welcome to you and to our studio and viewing audiences. So first, let's talk a bit more about why now. Has the legislature actually refused to bring up the issue, or is it just a matter of priorities? Who wants to begin?
I'll begin.
Delia? Okay.
Absolutely. The question really is not why now, but why have we waited so long? Back in 1994, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service published a study that documented that Colorado can support wolves. We've worked through various means for 25 years. All of them have failed. So the time is long past for wolf restoration in Colorado. We have tried various legislative means. They haven't worked. We feel that the grassroots have spoken. The grassroots are the public. The public has said, we want wolves. Long and durable polling, starting in the 1980s, has consistently said that the vast majority of Coloradans want wolves restored to Colorado. They want a natural balance restored for future generations of humans and future generations of wildlife.
Anyone else want to chime in?
I'd like to jump in. First of all, thank you for allowing us to be here today. I think this is a great topic. And I would argue that the reason we've waited until now is, just as you mentioned earlier, that wildlife experts like the Colorado Parks and Wildlife have already said no multiple times. And we at the Colorado Farm Bureau, who represent farmers and ranchers across the state, nearly 25,000 of them, truly feel that not only is this dangerous for their future, but it's irresponsible to ask the people like you and I and the people sitting in this room and across the metro area to decide the fate of the farmers and ranchers and the local communities on the western slope. We need to really think about the importance of not looking at the ballot box as a way to force biology, but instead looking to Colorado Parks and Wildlife experts to make the decision. And that's why I would argue that we've waited until now.
Okay, any other comments on that one?
I would agree with Taylor's comments. I would also add that instead of going to the ballot, we believe that the Colorado way is to find solutions to tough answers and to gather all stakeholders to find those solutions. It's to gather those wolf proponents. It's to gather livestock producers and answer and find a way to maybe find a solution that all works for everybody, rather than try to steamroll the public into ballot box biology instead of listening to Colorado Parks and Wildlife.
Okay, Rick, you've been involved in some of this conversation. What have you been involved with?
Well, I look at this from the perspective that 85% of the state's population occurs along the very sort of narrow ribbon of Interstate 25, 160 miles of the Front Range. And 15% of the state's population live on the shortgrass prairies to the east of I-25 and to the west of the Continental Divide. And it does seem, it's certainly democratic to vote, and there isn't any denying that, but it does seem like sort of piling on. The Front Range can pretty much get whatever it wants just by the sheer mass of people. And so I don't view this as actually a black and white thing. If it's going to happen, then what I would like to see is, for a change, the Colorado Front Range show consideration for the rural communities on the West Slope. It's going to be there. The wolves are going to be in their backyard 365 days a year. The rest of us are going to go on a family vacation and sit around a campfire and hope we hear a wolf howl and go back to the office on Monday and say, wow, that was amazing. But we really don't have any skin in the game. We do have a vote, and it's democracy. But they are the ones. And so if we are going to do this, I would love to see us show respect for the rural communities on the West Slope. They are the ones that are going to have to live with wolves. And this is not just a wolf issue in Colorado. We have governor after governor in Colorado forming their cabinet. They don't have anybody on their cabinet from the shortgrass prairies east of I-25 from the West Slope. So we kind of take their water, and some of you know about the tunnels that go on underneath the Continental Divide. And then the door prize, or the booby prizes, we'll give them wolves too, without so much as a buy your leave.
Delia, what do you have to say?
Well, there's several issues that were brought up. One, this concept, this phrase, ballot box biology. Very clearly, Initiative 107 directs Colorado Parks and Wildlife to use best science. We recognize the expertise of CPW's biologists. Unfortunately, decisions have been made that are political decisions with regard to wolf restoration. It has not been a biological issue, it has not been a scientific issue. All of the science very clearly documents that ecosystems become healthier, that biological diversity is enhanced, that forests and shrublands are restored. So the science is very clear. Up until now, the decisions have been made by politicians. Importantly, and I'm sure you know this, that Colorado Parks and Wildlife's commission is vastly dominated, not by scientists, but by agriculture, by ranching, by recreation, and by sports hunting. There are no scientists on that board to make a decision. Really very important. Second, just because you live in Denver doesn't mean that you don't have a right to say what happens on your public lands on the West Slope. I happen to live on the West Slope. I happen to live in a very rural community, and I hope to see wolves in my backyard, which is not a backyard, which is Forest Service land. Those public lands, whether you're in New York City or whether you're in Florida, the beauty of public lands is that they are public, that we all have a say-so. I have skin in the game, you have skin in the game, everybody has skin in the game with regard to public lands, because I want to see and I want to make sure that future generations of Coloradans, whether they're human future generations, whether they're wildlife future generations, all have a natural balanced ecosystem in which to thrive.
Okay, I have a question because my committee has given me all kinds of information. And one of the things that I have is a poll conducted by Colorado State University and a survey company called Qualtrees. It was done in August of 2019, and it surprised me very much. And I don't know, are any of you familiar with that survey? So what does that show? So I would like you to answer it rather than me.
It surprised me as well because I thought this was shaping up to be an east slope, west slope, a front range, west slope sort of thing. But it showed that people on the west slope, including hunters, were actually in favor of reintroducing wolves.
And the statistics are amazing, actually. I don't know if you have the statistics, but I have it from this article.
Absolutely. Dr. Becky Nimick was the lead on the study. 84% of Coloradans support and will vote for wolf restoration in Colorado. We're not just talking about the Front Range. We're not just talking about city folks telling country folks what to do. We're talking about the entirety of Colorado. And this is durable, long-term support for wolf restoration in Colorado. And I think that occurs because the folks have gotten past the rhetoric, have gotten past the myth. They've gotten past the idea that we should be making decisions based on the myth that wolves are going to destroy our lives. They haven't. We have 25 years of data from the Northern Rocky Mountains. Wolves have not destroyed the livestock industry.
We're getting ahead of ourselves.
But the question is, why would 84% of Coloradans, it's a surprise to everyone, I think. It wasn't really surprising to me. We've been doing education and outreach for years and years. And with that education and outreach, people come to realize that this is a very easy thing to do. Wolves are easy to accommodate. Lives are not going to be destroyed. Everything is going to be fine. And so with revealing the truth, with getting past the myth, with getting past the rhetoric, people are making decisions based on reality.
Okay, go ahead. Sure.
Thank you. I think when we talk about polling and public opinion, I think that's important, but I don't think that's also the whole story. Colorado is very different than the Northern Rockies and other places where we've introduced wolves. We've heard that Idaho, Wyoming, Montana have all had wolves introduced, but that's a very different environment than it is here. Colorado has nearly twice the population that those areas do. And the lines between wilderness and grazing and our local agriculture, our local communities are very, very thin. Our farmers and ranchers are used to working with experts like Fish and Wildlife in the U.S. Parks, or the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Department, to bring in species to ensure that they're protected, to ensure that their livestock is protected and their local community is protected. And truthfully, that's the way this process needs to happen. Us deciding here in this room that that's how our farmers and ranchers and our local community should deal with a species, no matter what the species is. That's not how the process should work. We've seen a lot of great and successful programs with species like the black-footed ferret, with moose, with other species that truthfully aren't predators. I don't think, at least nobody at this table is screaming up that wolves are going to ruin our lives. I don't think that's necessarily true, but I think we have to talk about the reality that there will be some impacts. And those impacts are not going to affect people here. While they may want to see the wolves and while they may want to experience that, their livelihoods aren't at stake. Rural communities, folks like the Grand Junction Chamber of Commerce also oppose this, and we're seeing county commissioners across the state oppose this. Whether it's a political issue or not, it's at the ballot box that ultimately makes this political. And it's going to affect people's lives, and it's going to affect our wilderness and other populations that are currently in that place.
Okay, well, what about the Donovan Bill? What do you know about that, and what's the point of that? Rick, you know?
So Senator Donovan from Eagle has a Senate bill. It's 20-121. In fact, I think it has its first hearing next week on March 4th. What that bill does is give us 2 additional years. So it stretches out the time of beginning the reintroduction until December 31st of 2025. So that would give us 5 full years to have these conversations. There's this old saying that if you want to go far, go alone. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So Senator Donovan's bill would give us flexibility. First of all, it would say we won't even have to reintroduce them if we have a sustaining population of wolves that have come here on their own.
And do we know what a sustaining population is?
No, that's a qualitative term. And secondly, it gives us 5 years to have these conversations like we had for 2 days this month in Glenwood Springs, where we had the entire spectrum of people who had opinions about wolves in Colorado. And we were civil to each other, we respectfully listened, and we tried to find common ground. And so I think Senator Donovan's bill would be an improvement upon the ballot initiative, which still gives us 3 years. But we really will have to roll up our sleeves and try to get the human and economic dimensions of this argument correct.
What would happen if both passed? Because one is on the ballot, I don't think you take it off.
So the important thing is that if Senator Donovan's bill did pass, I think it would let a lot of air out of the balloon for a ballot in November, because it would pass this session.
But isn't that already on the ballot? Can they take it off?
Yes, yes.
Oh,
they should.
okay. And suppose both pass? What has
So-
precedence? Does anyone know?
Let me, basically, Senator Donovan's bill, if it would pass first. And if we kept the Initiative 107 on the ballot, because it was after Senator Donovan's bill, it would take precedence. So let me say something, though, that Senator Donovan's bill, very clearly, the purpose of Senator Donovan's bill is to fully recover wolves in Colorado. The benefits may be that it is more inclusive and less rancorous. We agree, as far as proponents of Initiative 107, we agree on many points. There are some points that we disagree on, and we hope to come to agreement. The points that we agree on are that all Coloradans should be fully engaged, that this should be a decision by Coloradans for Coloradans. We agree that we need to respectfully include all Coloradans, and that wolves must be humanely and ethically managed. There are some really important points in Initiative 107. One, Colorado Parks and Wildlife are the managers. We recognize the expertise of the biologists in Colorado Parks and Wildlife. The second is that they must use best science, current best science in their management. Third, and I think this is a fallacy, 107 absolutely engages all Coloradans in the decision-making process. 107 very clearly states that input from the public is required. So we're not dismissing Coloradans. We're absolutely requiring, in the language of 107, that all Coloradans have the potential to be fully engaged in the process. And third, that compensation, if there's confirmed livestock losses, that those losses would be compensated for, and conflict avoidance strategies are accounted for and provided for in Initiative 107. So we have an inclusive process. We hope that Senator Donovan's bill may be more inclusive, so that we truly get a bill by Coloradans, for Coloradans, all Coloradans.
Okay, now what about the idea of doing nothing at this point, because a wolf pack, I think of approximately 6 wolves, has been seen in the northwest part of the state? Does anybody have some comments on that?
I would love to jump in if you don't mind.
Okay.
I think these conversations and these two topics go very well hand in hand when talking about whether it be the ballot initiative, whether it be a legislative bill, or whether it be natural movement of wolves into the state. I think to quickly jump back to Senator Donovan's bill, one thing that I think is incredibly important about what she's doing, while we at the Colorado Farm Bureau and our farm and ranching members don't support wolf introduction of any kind, I think that her idea and her clear understanding of the fact that we also have to be able to pay for this is really important. And when we're asking voters to go to the ballot, and while it may be an inclusive process, it will then be a requirement for the state to move through with this. There won't be any question about whether or not we can pay for this. I mean, we live in a state. We know Tabor exists. Our budget are thin because we have livestock reimbursement if any animal is killed. That money is going to have to come from somewhere, and it's going to come from state services and programs. And we truly believe that at the Colorado Farm Bureau, if wolves are going to come here, we can't decide that. Our farmers and ranchers can't decide if wolves are going to move into the state. But what we can decide is if we as the voters choose that for them. And we would ask people to say, no, do not choose that for the Western Slope. Do not choose that for local communities. If the wolves are gonna come, let them come. Let Parks and Wildlife use their current management plan and find a way where we can all work together, not just forcing a species to live and survive on the Western Slope.
Okay, Rick?
Yeah, I'd like to say something in support of that. Actually, we have 5 natural reintroduction experiments fully underway right now. 2 in the Midwest. The state of Wisconsin has 227 packs, and the state of Michigan has 139, and they came there on their own. The state of Minnesota never lost its wolves. And then on the Pacific Rim states, the state of Washington has 27 packs. The first pack showed up in 2008. State of Oregon now has about a dozen packs, and the state of California has 1 pack in the northern part of the state. So there's 5 states that show what's occurring as we speak in the state of Colorado might very well be the future of this. And as Delia said, I'm sorry, a ballot is going to be a rancorous approach to putting wolves into the West Slope. If the wolves are willing to do this grand experiment on their own, and like I said, the upper Midwest has done it and it's worked, and now our 3 Pacific Rim states, they have done it and it's worked. It's probably going to work in Colorado.
Okay, go ahead, Erin.
Thank you. I would also add, so Colorado Parks and Wildlife has confirmed that there's a pack of 4 to 6 wolves in northwest Moffat County, and our ranchers have been affected by that, and they are supportive of naturally occurring wolves. Where we have a problem is forcing wolves to live here when they might very well go across the borders or not particularly like the habitat of Colorado. So let them choose what they would like to do. I think it's a very, very dangerous path when we think about managing biology and forcing introduction by the ballot box. And I would refer to Rick because I know we've heard from biologists that when we have naturally occurring packs and we reintroduce them, there could be competition between those different populations. And so I'd refer to you as it could be, in the end, detrimental to actually both populations of the wolves that would happen.
Well, now, how many are we talking about? We haven't really, we're talking in hundreds, but I don't think those are the numbers they're expecting. Delia?
So let's step back for a second because there's some terminology here that's been kind of used fast and free. A pack, when you say a pack of wolves, it's a breeding pair. That's a scientific definition of a wolf pack. We don't yet have that. What we have are 4 or 5 or 6 wolves that are very closely genetically related, likely brother and sister. So for the past 25 years, we've had a few wolves that have made it to Colorado across the human gauntlet that is now Wyoming. All of those wolves have died or disappeared. It's a celebration that these 4 or 5 or 6 little wolves made it across that gauntlet that is Wyoming. And it gives life to the idea that indeed Colorado can support wolves. But 4 or 5 or 6 wolves is not a viable population, and there is a definition of a viable population, Rick. 4 or 5 or 6 wolves is not a viable population. To have a viable population, we need a reintroduction with sufficient number of wolves that's genetically diverse enough to enable them to disperse across the state for long-term, better than 250 years, genetic viability. That 4 or 5 or 6 wolves does not have that possibility. For that to occur, we need a reintroduction.
And so I read a number between 15 and 30. Is that what we're talking about?
As an actual reintroduction, basically, let's look to Yellowstone, let's look to Idaho. We reintroduced 31 wolves into Yellowstone, and we introduced 37 wolves into Idaho. And those wolves, basically, it was really important when they reintroduced those wolves to ensure the genetic diversity of those wolves so that they could be viable for the long term. We don't have that right now. So we're looking at, if we could reintroduce 30, 40, 50 wolves to Colorado with sufficient genetic diversity, that could happen. So that's all we're talking about. We're not talking about initially reintroducing 500. We're talking about reintroducing into appropriate areas on the west slope that has suitable habitat, meaning lack of humans and abundant elk, where wolves could take a foothold and reproduce and become into a viable population.
And we're talking about public lands now, right? Not private.
We are talking about public lands in Colorado. Yes, wolves disperse, absolutely. And I want to address something that Rick said, and this is important to look at. Wolves have dispersed across into Washington and Oregon and down into California. They have an easy pathway. They don't have Wyoming. Wyoming considers wolves and classifies wolves as vermin. Except up in the very northwest corner that is Yellowstone, wolves can be killed 365 days a year, as many as you possibly can, any time of the day. Outside of Yellowstone National Park, it is a gauntlet of death for wolves, and that is why wolves have not been able to make it down into Colorado except for a very few. It's much different when you make it from Montana and Idaho over into Washington. Wolves are treated much differently. The pathway is much easier. Yes, wolves would disperse, and we hope that they disperse.
Do you want to change topics?
Well,
Well, I mean, that's
I
something.
want to know some statistics of where wolves have been reintroduced, what has happened. We haven't talked about hunting yet. We've been skirting that, but I think that's part of the problem or part of the issue. And I think Delia has some statistics, and I don't know if you want to talk about that, about the impact on hunters.
Well, I can say a few things. So Colorado, surprisingly, and we have the third densest human population of the western states, behind the state of California and the state of Washington. So we're a very dense state. As Taylor said, our population is actually almost twice the population of our three northern Rocky Mountain states, where wolves were first reintroduced 25 years ago. So we have the largest state elk population. And we harvest about 40 to 50,000 elk a year. So that's something hunters are doing. So you've got a level of predation there. Interestingly, the elk in Colorado, if you guys are reading the news in different parts of the state, the dynamics of elk are really in a state of flux. I mean, you read all these alarming headlines about the elk in the Durango area, about the elk population almost cutting in half in the Vail area, about the elk actually in Rocky Mountain National Park. On the eastern part of the park, we had 1,200 elk, and I understand we had culling. That stopped maybe 6 to 8 years ago. We're down to 300 or 400 elk now on the east side of Rocky Mountain National Park because for some reason they've pulled out and gone down valley to the private lands and are hanging out there. And maybe because, I have no idea why. On the west side of the park, the moose population is increasing, and they're probably, a noted plant ecologist says within this decade, we'll probably lose the riparian vegetation. So these things are all in a state of flux. It's not clear at all. But one thing that is perfectly clear, any place in the West is an amazingly complicated mosaic of administrative boundaries. For people to talk about reintroducing wolves on the public lands, that is true until the day after they have reintroduced them. Look at any suite of state, federal, county, city, private administrative boundaries, most anywhere, for example, on the West Slope, and you're going to see private land, public land, state lands, federal lands, and that'll be in BLM, the Forest Service, the Park Service, whatever. And probably just simply a matter of time before they come into North Park. And allegedly, we have a single black wolf trying to make a living today in North Park. And then they'll, of course, have been east of the Continental Divide. So these things, to talk with this sort of assumed certainty of black and white is risky talk at best. I think science does know how to reintroduce wolves. They absolutely know how to do that. But science, so the best possible science, we keep using this term, what science does not do is should we reintroduce wolves? That's all of a sudden we've left the scientific domain and we're in the human dimension and economic dimension domains. And that is filtered through all these different values of different publics. There is no public. If there was one public, life would be so much simpler. There's so many diverse publics. And you have to filter whether we should and how we should do it through that complex array.
Okay, well, let's look at some of those figures over there. Delia, can you just show us some of that? And there's no reason, I don't think, why you can't get up and point to that, or if, I don't know if people at home can see those figures.
Well, I want to first clarify a concept that keeps getting thrown out by everyone, that Colorado has a huge human density. And I will agree absolutely that on the Front Range it does. And according to Colorado State Demographer, 84% of Colorado's population will live in the Front Range. 11% of Colorado's population will live on the western tier counties, Garfield, Moffett, Rio Blanco, and so on. And just the remaining 5% are distributed between the Central Mountains and the Eastern Plains. 5%. Not the density that we have. The density indeed in the Central Mountains and on the West Slope is similar to the density that we see in Montana. So get that out of the way. Let's just clear that up. We don't have a dense population on the West Slope of Colorado, according to the Colorado State Demographer. As far as these numbers go, we have about 286,000 elk in Colorado. That's post-hunt numbers in all of the northern Rocky Mountain states. The elk population and hunter success is either stable or it has increased since wolf restoration in Colorado, and the numbers are up there behind me. You can take a look at those. In Colorado, as far as the elk go, hunters kill about 40,000 of them per year. If we had wolves in Colorado, each wolf on average kills about 1 elk per month. So say we double that. Say, oh my God, wolves in Colorado are really hungry. They're for some reason. And they kill two elk per month. That means that 500 wolves would kill about 12,000 elk. That's about 4% of the post-hunt elk population in Colorado. And let's remember that wolves are targeting an entirely different demographic of elk than hunters are. Wolves are targeting the weak, the diseased, and the elderly. Hunters are targeting prime reproductive age females and bulls. So hunters are targeting the healthiest, wolves are targeting the weakest, and consequently, in that selective predation of the weak and the diseased, they are making our elk populations healthier. If I were a hunter, which I'm not, you might have guessed, wolves are a hunter's best friend. They indeed are the big bull elks that hunters so covet, are in large part due to the evolutionary selective pressure of predation on those populations. So as far as the elk population goes in Colorado, what we've seen up in the northern Rockies is that the elk populations are stable or better, and hunter success is stable or better than prior to wolf reintroduction.
Okay, any more comments on that one? Yes, go ahead.
I know we keep coming back to having the conversation about where people live in the state and whether, I think clearly this is a very complex issue when we talk about, well, how do we introduce them, what makes sense? But I think that complexity and the conversation about numbers and biology is, again, exactly why this November, when people go to the ballot, they shouldn't be deciding this. We talk about 85% living here, and people may have a right to our public lands and to see it, but that 85% that you mentioned that aren't living there, 84%, thank you. That 84% that aren't living there, the 5% that are really gonna be there, they're the people that are being impacted and affected by this. And
Then you have the poll that shows something different. So how do you explain that?
I mean, we know what happens to poll in our last presidential election. So I think we should be careful when it comes to polls. And I again, truly do believe, not only for our farmers and ranchers, but for our broad coalition of folks that have joined us, this is scary. This works up our people. This gets our farmers and ranchers worked up in ways that, as a communications person, I haven't seen before. And it makes us very, very nervous. We feel it sets a bad precedent. And truthfully, at least Senator Donovan's bill, while we still don't support Senator Donovan's bill fully, this shouldn't be done in November by being able to check yes or no. That puts a huge burden on the rest of our Colorado residents to be able to decide what happens when we have questions about how many elk they'll kill, where they'll be, where they'll roam. Like that just, it puts an extreme amount of unknowns on this state, and the people that are going to bear that risk are people living west of the Continental Divide.
Okay, go ahead.
I would just add that we see it too, that our ranchers are very, very scared. One of our most progressive members, Bill Fales from Carbondale, Colorado, said that he is afraid that if wolves are introduced, he will be out of business. And when I think about that, and I think about what do ranchers provide to Colorado, 80% of critical habitat for species is on private lands. And if we lose that, we lose habitat for sage grouse, for moose, for black-footed ferrets. And when I think about Bill Fels scared in Carbondale, or when I think about other ranchers in Meeker, Colorado, scared that they will lose their places that they've had for generations, I think that's why people see livestock producers getting so defensive and so scared, is because this is their livelihoods. And this is where that's where their families make a living. And that if we lose them, we lose rural communities. We lose the whole Colorado, why we love Colorado. And so I think it's a very dangerous path that we're down, and that Colorado is down.
Okay, is there any evidence that the introduction of wolves has an effect on the ecology, the ecological system? Do we know anything about that?
Absolutely, we do.
Okay, go ahead.
And boy, that's a segue that I would like to address with that slide right up there, because
Okay,
she
there's
talked
another
about,
slide,
yeah,
okay.
with numbers. So I understand, and Bill Fales is a neighbor, lives right down the road from me. I've known him for a very long time, and his wife, Marge Perry. I understand the myth, I understand the rhetoric, but we have not seen that. We have not seen ranchers go out of business in the Northern Rockies. We have not seen livestock devastated. We have just not seen, and I understand the fear, but I also understand that there's nothing to support that fear. There is no reality. There's no that's a fear based in a myth. And all we need to do is look at the numbers. And these numbers are from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They're not my numbers. These are confirmed losses. And so if we look up there, what we can see is that the vast majority of livestock are never involved in depredations. Basically, 99.9% of livestock will never be impacted by wolves. That is information from the USDA. We can look to Montana as a good analog for Colorado. You know, yes, the environment is the same. I'm an ecologist. You're a wildlife biologist, Rick. Colorado and the Northern Rockies are very similar. They have mountains in Montana, they have plains. And in Montana, most of the wolves are up in the mountains. In Montana, what we see is that in wolf country in Montana, there's about 500,000 cattle and about 165,000 sheep. Average losses per year over the last decade or so, you look up on that slide, the numbers are up there. What we've seen is the loss of about 50 cattle per year out of 500,000 or 550,000, whatever it is, and about 65 sheep. In Colorado, we have a similar situation. On the West Slope, we have about 550,000 cattle and about 175,000 sheep. We could expect the same kinds of losses. Even if for some reason we have really hungry wolves and they eat twice as many elk as they do up in Montana, and they eat twice as many cattle and sheep, our losses are so minimal. And Initiative 107 compensates ranchers for those losses. And what we've seen in places like the Tom Miner Basin and the Wood River Wolf Project is that if conflict avoidance strategies are implemented, losses often go to zero. In the Tom Miner Basin, there have been no losses of cattle for the past 4 years, using some very straightforward, very basic conflict avoidance strategies like range riders. So we don't have to have depredation. We don't have to persist in this myth that wolves and livestock have to be in conflict. We don't have to do that.
Okay, I have a question too. What about coyotes? Do they kill more animals than wolves?
And I would just add,
By far.
I would just also add that deprivation is not the full story. I'm very, very proud that I went to CSU and got an animal science degree. And what we learn in that is cattle and sheep are prey animals. And when a predator, coyotes, mountain lions, wolves are around, it's not about the kill, but it's also the stress of the animal. And so when they're stressed, we, as predators, humans, we stress eat, right? When we're scared. When they're scared or frightened, they don't eat, and they're in a constant state of fight or flight. And so I don't think deprivation is the full story. And that's why when we were talking to Carrie Donovan, and also when we look at this bill about compensation, we have asked the proponents to also, when we talk about compensation, to include direct and indirect effects. And we look at the European model of that, and that accounts for compensation if a wolf is in the radius of where these animals are produced. And actually, the proponents are, and when we talked to them, were against that compensation plan. And so I would just caution you that deprivation is not the complete story.
Let me just respond real quickly because I agree. And that is why in states like Washington and Oregon and Idaho and Wyoming and Montana, depredations that are confirmed are compensated from, 3.5 times to 7 times, understanding that stress reduces the weight on the cattle and so on. On the other hand, there are techniques. For instance, reinstilling the herding instinct is a main one, so that instead of running when predators are around, cattle herd up and they put their young in the middle. And it works really well. It's what bison do. It's what muskox do. So going back and doing those conflict avoidance strategies do work. And we've seen them work. They're successful. We don't have to have conflict. Paying a rancher for the presence of wolves is something we consider. Absolutely. If we know that there's a denning site on a rancher's public land grazing allotment, to pay them to not put their livestock there is a strategy that could be discussed. And Initiative 107, actually, that's why that public input is so important, and that's why we insist on a restoration plan being by Coloradans, for Coloradans, and including that voice and those strategies in a discussion about how we get there.
Okay, are there any questions in the audience? Oh, okay, a few hands up. Go ahead.
My name is Melissa, and I'm sorry, remind me of your name? Erin. I just had a question, because I'm actually a long-term volunteer at the Wolf Sanctuary, the local one up here, and we are right down the road from a cattle ranch, and we have cattle that come right onto our property and go right up to the enclosures, and they seem more curious than scared. And I realize that these are captive wolves. I know that they're not wild wolves. It's not the same thing. But kind of going off of what Delia was saying, just going, how would I say this? Going for cattle that are perhaps more ancient breeds, that have more herding instincts, that are less flighty than, say, Angus cattle. Could that possibly be a better solution than just no wolves at all?
I would just say that we are completely against reintroducing wolves, but we are willing to work with the naturally free-ranging wolves. So I will say that. We actually worked when the wolf sanctuary went in, and there's a radius that they put in because of the concern of cattle. So that I don't necessarily think they're going up, and they also accounted for that since cattle are stressed by predators such as coyotes and wolves. Sorry, I might have forgot. Oh, ancient breeds. Sorry, I forgot about that. I will say, when ranchers produce, we have to remember ranchers are producing food, and they're producing a product that people eat. And when we think about that, it's not just about herding animals, but there's a lot of different components, and it's very complex when we're producing food. And we've worked really hard over the years to improve that product and improve our food. And I will say that herding animals haven't changed over the years. They're the same animals, and their product has improved. And so I will say, no matter the breed, they're always going to be stressed when a predator is around.
Anybody else want to reply?
Let me, because I actually study the response of wildlife to stress. And there's basically three types of response that wildlife can show, and now I'm assuming cows. If it's a negative stimulus, wildlife shows an aversion, so they'll run away, fly, retreat. If it's a reward, they actually show attraction, and so they'll come up to you, and all of you at some point or another have fed wildlife, and you've demonstrated attraction. And if there's neither a negative stimulus or a positive reward, they just habituate. Once those wolves are out of the cages and they start chasing cows and they start chasing elk, and I think we're totally all in agreement on that, we're going to start seeing aversion. And so cows are going to run from them, and elk are going to run from them, and moose are going to run from them.
What we've actually seen in the Northern Rockies, because there's experience there, they had to figure out, can we live with carnivores? Can we live with large carnivores? The answer is yes. What cattlemen have been able to do is what's called reinstill a herding instinct, so that cattle do not run when wolves come around, just like elk stand their ground. If an elk is healthy and strong, he stands his ground, and the wolf, a wolf weighs 100 pounds. All they've got is their teeth to take down this 800-pound elk or this 1,200-pound cow. If the elk stands its ground, the wolf goes away, because that's not the weak. That's not the one that the wolf wants to go after. So teaching cows actually can happen, and it does happen, and it has happened, and it's very successful. So teaching cows to stand their ground and to herd up, put their young in the middle so that they don't turn and run, so that that predatory instinct to chase isn't triggered, does happen, has happened, works very well. So we don't have to have conflict. It's a myth. It's one of those myths. And I also want to say, there's this again, along the table, there's been this concept that wolves will wander in on their own. We've put up political barriers. We've put up physical barriers in Wyoming, the roads and the fracking and the so on, and the legal barriers to wolves moving to Colorado from New Mexico and Arizona. They can't come north of I-40 legally. We've put up all kinds of barriers for wolves to get to Colorado. And indeed, only a few have made it in 25 years. I think it's somewhat an odd concept to think that after all of these political, physical, cultural, legal barriers, that they're somehow going to make it here. A few make it through, most don't, most die. So we need a reintroduction.
Okay.
I'll just add, just since I'll
Quickly.
just jump in through the end. I think one more thing to clarify is the process by which we're going. We've seen wolf introductions in these other places, like we've talked about, done by folks like the U.S. Parks and Wildlife. This is happening at the ballot. We're asking people like you and me to vote, and that's not fair to them, and that's not fair to the wolf.
I think there was another question. Let's go to the audience. Have a question.
My name is Sue Ellen Markey, and I'm going to resist the temptation of how you train a cow or an elk. But my question is probably just as silly. This literature refers to the gray wolf or gray wolves. Why is that the one that would be introduced, and how does that wolf differ from some other kind of wolf? Why is that important?
Canis lupus is Canis lupus is Canis lupus. Canis lupus is the wolf that would be reintroduced to Colorado. There are numerous subspecies. At one time, there were actually 24 identified subspecies of gray wolf in the lower 48. There's lumping, there's splitting. There are numerous subspecies. Canis lupus occidentalis is a subspecies. Importantly, a subspecies is just that, it's a subspecies. Wolves disperse, like everybody has said, and because they disperse, they move, they have never speciated into a separate species. Regardless of whether it's one of the biologists that was involved in the reintroduction in Yellowstone, he said, basically, whether it's Canis lupus occidentalis or irremotus or nubilis, it's Canis lupus irregardless.
Okay, one more question.
Hi, my name is Christina Gaylor, and I'm actually a rancher, and I'm working with ranches since I was born. Can I have a couple of questions, actually? Because
Sure, quick ones.
Okay, because I have question from Taylor, right? Is it? And Erin. So the first one then, you keep mentioning about the population of Colorado. Have you considered is this working? Okay.
Yes.
Have you considered to discuss this kind of question with states where, for example, in Minnesota or Michigan has 9,800,000 population, and they have over 900 wolf population, to talk with them about how they take care of this kind of question or issue with high population?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Colorado Farm Bureau is a part of the American Farm Bureau Association, which has farm bureaus across every state. And over the years, we've been intimately in conversations with our counterparts over there, and our counterparts where, like you mentioned, Minnesota and Michigan. And functionally, Colorado is very different. We talked about introductions up north and down south, and they're U.S. Fish and Wildlife and those that the government entities and the experts that introduced wolves in these other states specifically chose not to introduce them into Colorado. They are the experts, and they're who we defer to. And I think it's important, incredibly important, as you mentioned, to talk with folks in Michigan, folks in Wyoming and Montana. Those are very different places than where we're at here. And really, again, I'll emphasize on the process. This isn't necessarily about, for us particularly, where wolves come, how they come, but it's about how they're coming. And no matter the process, no matter how good intentioned it is, we're still forcing this on Coloradans, we're still forcing this on the Western Slope. And that's at the ballot box, that's not through experts.
What's your other question? Is it a quick one?
Yeah, for Erin. So about cattle, I'm working with cattle myself, but have you considered to talk from even different countries' experts where wolves never been killed and how they continue to coexist with predators like wolves? Like, for example, Hungary in Europe has almost 10 million people, and they have about estimate 125 wolves, and it's the quarter size of Colorado. And Transylvania, Romania has millions of people, and they have 2,500 wolves, and their wolf population been there centuries and centuries, and ranchers are coexisting 100% well with wolves. They have more problems with bears. They barely have problems with wolves. Have you considered to talk with them as educate or learn more how they successful?
We haven't to this point, but I would also echo what Taylor said in that we are also a part of our national group, National Cattlemen's Beef Association. So we get to speak with states throughout the United States. And when we talk about it, I think ranchers can coexist. It's just learning about the effects of cattle. But when we think about what's happening in Colorado, it's just like Taylor said, it's how we're going about it. And we're going about it the right way. Instead of listening to our expert game wildlife management agency, Carl Parks and Wildlife, and the scientists in there, we're forcing it onto Coloradans that might, to be honest, probably are not the experts in this area. And even though they may want to see a wolf, they don't know all the impacts or all the factors to take into account. So I would say that it's how Colorado is going about introducing wolves.
Okay, for your final comments, we've come to the end of the hour. I found this quote, and I just thought you could each give a very quick thought about it. Humans do not have the right to choose which animals are convenient or not. Why don't we start here and go there, and you have 2 minutes. Each person has about 50 seconds, maybe. We'll get there.
I would say when I think about this quote, I don't think that humans have the right to have the right to think about introducing or forcing wolves to live in a certain habitat, but should allow them to choose what is suitable habitat and suitable territory for them to live in and let them choose rather than have humans choose for them.
Okay, Rick?
Well, humans are probably the apex predator. So we have our thumbs on the existence and how well all things do. So what I would say is that we should show respect for the natural communities, including wolves, and we should show respect. Sometimes we forget to do this for our other human communities. Both of those mean a lot to me, and I worry about both of them, the rural communities and the wolf populations that are going to come into the state being mostly unwelcomed west of the Continental Divide. So let's go slow and get this right and show respect for the rural communities.
Okay, Taylor?
I think that's very, very well said. And I mostly appreciate the fact that we're here having this conversation and able to talk about it. I would end by saying a few things. Wolves are here. We've seen them. Our ranchers on the Western Slope have seen them. Whether it's a few, whether it's a lot, they're here. And you're right. Humans don't get to choose what's convenient. But that's exactly what Initiative 107 is asking. It's asking you and me to choose whether or not they're here. And I would ask you and everybody watching as we go through the summer to vote no on Initiative 107 because, again, shouldn't be our decision. This needs to come from experts. This needs to ensure that it's done in a way that is respectful to all of our communities, and Initiative 107 is not that.
Go ahead, Delia.
Wolves were exterminated, virtually exterminated from the lower 48 at the behest of the livestock industry to increase their profits. We chose to exterminate and choose one animal over another. We chose domestic livestock over native wildlife. I hope that we can agree, at least, that all life and all wildlife matters, that all species matter. And if we can agree to that, I hope we can agree that there is some wisdom to nature, that there is a wisdom to the entire suite of species. To restore the suite of species, to restore all the actors on the evolutionary stage is essential to restoring the connections that enable ecosystem function and health.
I think that's it. Thank you to our panelists and for our studio and viewing audiences. We hope you will encourage others to watch this and other CrossCurrents programs. They are available at the League of Women Voters website and FCTV channels 14 and 881. They are also available on YouTube. Thanks again for tuning in.